This is Where We Live. I'm John Dankosky. E. coli is the bacteria that caused a 1993 food illness outbreak that killed 4 children and sickened at least 700 people. It got people thinking about how safe our food really is, and frankly, we hadn't really been thinking about it very much at all. Our food safety laws hadn't really been updated since the 1930s. Since that time, bacteria found in food has made thousands sick, and it's back in the news again. German health officials say more than 1,500 people have been affected by a new E. coli strain in Europe, and 18 are confirmed dead. Beyond the death toll, the economic effects of the outbreak are spreading throughout Europe. In Spain, farmers say they're losing $288 million per week, and lost sales could result in thousands of lost jobs. Today, we'll ask the question, how safe is the food we eat every day? We'll take a look at the moment in American history that changed the food industry for the better. The story is told in a new book by Jeff Benedict called Poisoned. But first, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro joins us to talk about what budget cuts to the FDA might mean for the historic food safety legislation that was recently passed by Congress. Rosa DeLauro, of course, represents the 3rd Congressional District. She joins us by phone today. Welcome back to the show, Congresswoman.
How are you? Good to talk to you, John.
I'm doing quite well. Maybe first you could explain the legislation that was passed back in December. It was, as I said, the first major change to the nation's food safety laws since the 1930s. What exactly would it do?
That's right. Well, first of all, it's the Food and Drug Administration. We passed the Food and Drug Administration Food Safety Modernization Act in December. It was a critical step in moving forward as we want to deal with addressing the problems of food safety, of the food safety system, and essentially is to reduce the number of foodborne illnesses in our country, many of which can be prevented. What it does, it helps improve the FDA's ability to respond to foodborne illness outbreaks, to be able to react more quickly. It deals with more inspection capability. It also will hold industrial food production facilities to higher standards. And as I said, the big issue is how do we work to identify the foodborne outbreaks more quickly, how we can identify the cause of those outbreaks, and the more quickly we can identify the outbreak, then we can work to prevent that. So the agencies, and in order to do that, the agencies are tasked with protecting the public health, need to work with rules and regulations that are scientifically sound and that are up to date, and that's what the legislation really focuses on.
So this is legislation that should be going into effect and should be helping us, but it requires money to actually put into effect. What has happened in the last several months? Are we in some jeopardy of this legislation not being able to have the full effect because of changes in the law or changes in the budget?
Yes, well, we are more than in some jeopardy. The House Appropriations Committee met night before last, and I sit on the House Agricultural Appropriations Committee, and there was the meeting to vote on the agriculture bill on the in the House, and the vote certainly not a bill that I voted for. Voted to cut back the funding for the Food and Drug Administration. You're probably looking at somewhere between an 11 and 12% cut in the Food and Drug Administration's budget, which in effect would make it almost impossible for them to implement the Food Modernization and Drug Safety Act. It really is going backward, and it is wrong-headed, and most of all, what it does is it puts the public health of the country at risk. And I think we're witnessing what's happening in Europe. Food safety is a problem. It's a big problem in the United States. Less than 1% of the food that we import is inspected, and there was a recent General Accounting Office report on the imported seafood and the health hazards as a result of imported seafood, and that's imported seafood from Vietnam, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from India, China, and it is a serious problem, and we should not be frivolously cutting budgets with regard to food safety. If one wants to look at how we can cut the deficit, I suggest that we go to the $41 billion that we provide in a tax subsidy to the oil companies, which are making money hand over fist, and not take chances with our public health. But that is as stark as it is. Now, this bill comes before the full House of Representatives in about 2 weeks, and it will be my intention, and I know the intention of others, to call serious attention to what is at risk with cutting back on food safety funds.
We're talking with Rosa DeLauro. She is, of course, a congresswoman who represents the 3rd District, and she serves on a subcommittee responsible for FDA and agriculture. She served as the chairman of that committee. Now, of course, with the changeover of power in the House of Representatives, there's a Republican who is chairman. What are the reasons being given for these cuts to food safety, if indeed we finally made some headway in food safety laws in the country, first time in decades and decades? Why? Is it just simply to save a couple million or $1 billion, Rosa DeLauro? What's the reason?
One of the issues is that that is a primary issue, that we currently have a deficit, and therefore we cannot afford to provide the resources for implementation of the food safety regulations. The second is, quite frankly, something that's hard for me to understand, is that I've heard quoted that, with the size of the country and the number of people, that the fact that 3,000 people die every year and hundreds of thousands fall ill for foodborne illnesses, that's a small percentage of our population. Except if you take a look at one of those 3,000 people who died as your child or your mother or your brother or so forth, it really is so wrong-headed, because these are illnesses that can be prevented, and we know that they can be prevented.
Well, but one thing to that point, I mean, if you're talking about inspecting all the food that comes into America, all the food that is grown in America, just statistically speaking, you cannot have every plate of food in America be completely and utterly safe. Right. So what is it you're aiming for?
Well, that is what the point is, and what the legislation does, is say let us identify those pathogens that are of the greatest risk, if you will. What are the foods that are at the greatest risk that those pathogens may show up in? What are the facilities in which there are the greatest risks? And then let us then, based on data and science, look at how we reduce and help prevent a foodborne illness. There isn't and with regard to imported food, I suspect that anyone would believe that inspecting more than 1%, since there is a much greater volume of food coming in from overseas these days, that 1% is hardly a standard, and that we should have a much higher percentage of imported food that is inspected. But again, if you're going to take a look at what one needs to calculate this against risk, where are the greatest risks? But in order to do that, you have to do it scientifically, and you have to do it based on sound data.
So one thing...
That's what the legislation would move us in the direction of doing.
Now, when people are looking at what's happening in Europe right now, I talked about some of the numbers earlier. How do our current regulatory standards compare with European standards? They're having a big problem. Do they have more lax standards? They have tighter standards than the U.S.?
They actually have tighter standards than we do. They actually have tighter standards. They also have single agencies which are focused. The European Union has a single agency, a food safety agency, to address these issues. We have 14 or 15 different agencies which address food safety issues in the United States. We should have one. But even with one in Europe, you look at the significant problems. There's another piece of the European problem as well, and that is in the bacteria that they have. They view it as an E. coli bacteria, but of a mutant strain. This is another area which I had language put into the report for the Agriculture Subcommittee, which asks the administration to move forward more quickly than they are. This is the Office of Management and Budget, to identify what are called non-toxic non-Shiga producing toxins of E. coli. This is a new area. The E. coli that was identified, and your next guest will talk about that in terms of Jack in the Box. There are other strains of E. coli. That's what they're talking about in Europe. It's a mutant strain. The fact of the matter is that USDA, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, have identified other strains. We're asking them to be labeled as an adulterant, which then becomes, we take greater precaution in our meat our meat plants and in other areas. But so far, the Office of Management and Budget hasn't moved in that direction. I put language in the bill that would urge the administration to act on the matter and to do it quickly, and to reinforce what the Congress's interest is in this matter.
So very quickly, you say that this is going to come up for a vote. Are you confident that you may be able to make some movement to be able to have some of this money put back into the FDA to allow this law that was passed to be fully enacted?
It's only going to happen with a national outcry that food safety and our public health is at risk if we don't do this. Because, quite frankly, we were in the minority in the House of Representatives, and the majority party voted in committee overwhelmingly for that cut night before last. And quite frankly, because these issues are not partisan issues, they shouldn't be partisan issues. But the vote was on a party line basis, with all the Democrats voting to increase funding or against decreasing funding for the Food and Drug Administration, and all of the Republicans voting for it. And I don't want to get into partisan politics. It's not a partisan issue. We should provide the Food and Drug Administration with the resources that it needs to protect public health. The public has to engage today. Mothers, fathers, go to a grocery store, buy a product, believe it is safe for their child, and then all of a sudden they are in serious difficulty and the potential for loss of life.
Rosa DeLauro is a congresswoman who represents the 3rd District. She serves on a subcommittee responsible for the FDA and agriculture. She's worked for a number of years on food safety issues. Congresswoman, as always, thank you very much for joining us here on Where We Live.
Thank you.
When we continue our conversation about food safety, we're going to take some phone calls from you at 860-275-7266. Are you concerned about the safety of your food? What will tighter regulation mean to the food industry? You can join us 860-275-7266 or email wherewelive@WNPR.org. We'll be joined next by Jeff Benedict. His new book is called Poisoned, the True Story of the Deadly E. coli Outbreak that changed the way Americans eat. That's coming up next, Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about food safety on the show today. There's a new outbreak of foodborne illness that has killed at least 18 people in Europe. It's a new strain of E. coli never before seen. We've also been talking about cuts to the budget of the FDA that could mean that brand new legislation might not be fully enacted. We just talked with Rosa DeLauro, a 3rd District congresswoman who's been working for years on food safety issues. We want to hear from you at 860-275-7266. Are you concerned about the safety of your food? What do you think tighter regulation will mean to the food industry? Again, 860-275-7266. We'll also be taking your emails, wherewelive@WNPR.org, and your tweets at Where We Live. But first, let's back up a minute, back to the first and largest E. coli outbreak in the U.S. In 1993, an outbreak caused by infected meat served at a Jack in the Box restaurant killed 4 children and poisoned about 750 people in total. Our next guest says that it changed the way Americans eat, and it changed many regulations and many FDA guidelines. Jeff Benedict is the author of Poisoned, the True Story of the Deadly E. coli Outbreak that changed the way Americans eat. Jeff Benedict, of course, you know from a number of books, and including books that are based right here in Connecticut, one called Little Pink House about the Kelo versus New London case, and another about the Indian reservations called Without Reservation. And I want to welcome back to the program Jeff Benedict. Thanks for being here, Jeff.
Good morning, John. It's great to be here.
So first, maybe you can take us back to this largest E. coli outbreak, the one that really got everything started, the one back in 1993. What exactly happened?
John, the Reader's Digest version basically is that in December of 92, a little girl in San Diego died from what was described as an unknown stomach ailment. it was E. coli that killed her, and she had eaten a Jack in the Box. But when she died in the hospital in San Diego, no one knew that that was the cause of her death. You got to remember that back then E. coli was not on our radar screen. Most people had never heard the term. We hadn't had a big outbreak in the U.S. at that point. But a month later in Seattle, dozens of kids started showing up in hospitals there with all the same symptoms: bloody diarrhea, severe cramping, destruction to kidneys and other vital organs. Fortunately, the top pediatric expert on E. coli worked at Children's Hospital in Seattle. He'd been trained at Yale in Connecticut. He knew what it was, and working with public health officials, they quickly identified it as E. coli and a particular strain that's virulent and comes from cattle. And they located Jack in the Box as the source because they were doing interviews with all the parents who were bringing these kids in. Seattle was the epicenter for the outbreak, but it did quickly spread to many western states, and ultimately over 750 kids got sick. 4 died. And the reason the outbreak was such a shock to Americans was because the notion that eating hamburgers could be lethal was an entirely new concept. And this story led the nightly news on NBC, ABC, and CBS for weeks. It was the first, major crisis of the Clinton administration. I mean, he'd been in office a couple of days when the outbreak started. It blindsided the Secretary of Agriculture, and it just had a huge cultural effect on how we look at fast food.
But why didn't we know anything about E. coli beforehand? Obviously, this is something that was studied. It was something that very well could have been making its way into our food supply all along. Why didn't we know more about it at the time?
That's a great question. The reason is because E. coli hasn't been around forever in terms of showing up in our food system. But prior to this outbreak, there had been some small outbreaks. In fact, 2 involving McDonald's, one in Michigan and one in Oregon. But those cases, when they were written up in the New England Journal of Medicine, didn't even identify McDonald's as the restaurant. It just said Restaurant A. So there hadn't been really big press coverage on E. coli. The people who knew about it at that time were basically the insiders, people in the meat industry, people at the CDC, the FDA, and microbiologists. But the consumer didn't know about it. In fact, the CEO of Jack in the Box had never heard of E. coli. And here he is running the 5th largest fast food chain that serves hundreds of thousands of pounds of meat every year. So it really was it was a new rising germ. And there were only 4 states in the country in 1993 that considered it an adulterant, and the federal government didn't treat it as an adulterant. In some ways, it's similar, John, to what's going on right now in America, that there are a host of other strains, and Congresswoman DeLauro mentioned this briefly, but there's a bunch of other strains of E. coli that have emerged that are also lethal, and our government currently does not consider them adulterants, meaning they don't inspect for them. It's not illegal for them to show up in food, and it shouldn't be that way because if they don't change that policy, you could have a repeat effect of what we had in '93.
Well, one of the things, though, as you look at the European outbreak right now, we're hearing that it's a brand new strain. How do you test for a new strain you've never seen before?
Well, they can test for it. I mean, there's actually been, just in the United States, there hasn't been really much press coverage of this, but there has been private research done. In other words, government didn't fund it, but there's a research firm based in Seattle, a laboratory that has gone out and randomly purchased meat in grocery stores in the West and tested it for 6 other strains of E. coli, none of which are currently tested for in any of our plants or facilities in the U.S. And they found plenty of evidence of these other strains showing up in food products. And so the technology is there. It's a matter of getting this very slow-moving, massive federal system of agencies to come on board with the idea that it's worth spending the money and the time to test for these other strains of E. coli. It's not that they don't have the technology. It's that they don't have the will and have allocated the money to do it.
We're talking with Jeff Benedict, who's a distinguished professor of English at Southern Virginia University and the author of a new book called Poisoned, the True Story of the Deadly E. coli Outbreak That Changed the Way Americans Eat. And we're talking today about food safety in America as budget cuts hack away at the FDA and as a new strain of of E. coli is killing people in Europe. We want to hear from you about how safe you think your food is. 860-275-7266. Maybe you can go through some of the characters you profiled in this book, because it does tell a fairly remarkable story, Jeff Benedict, about how we get from a population that doesn't know anything about E. coli and just assumes the hamburgers we are eating are safe, to a world in which it seems like every couple years we end up hearing about some other outbreak that's killing people. Who are the main characters that you tell the story through?
I chose to make the main character actually a lawyer from Seattle named Bill Marler, who at the time of the outbreak had only been practicing law a few years, and he was probably the least likely candidate to end up representing hundreds of kids in a foodborne illness outbreak. But he does, and he does some remarkable things when he takes on Jack in the Box. He's in some ways he's way out of his league, but he does things that were so non-traditional. It really shook up the whole business of how foodborne illness cases are litigated and handled by insurance companies. He put the screws to Jack in the Box, and he also pioneered some new methods. And what was really fascinating to me, and the other reason I chose to use him as the main character, is because he went on to become he's now the number one foodborne illness lawyer in the world. He's considered one of the major experts in the world, and he was a big force behind the passage of the Food Modernization Act back in December. He's become more than a lawyer on this stuff. He's become an advocate and a champion for food safety, and so he was my main character. And then I used the families whose kids were caught up in the outbreak, and I was able to work with three mothers, two of whom lost children in the outbreak, and one of whom whose daughter was in a coma for 40 days, and she really became the poster child of the outbreak. Her name is Brianne Kiner. She was 9 years old when she got sick. She turned 10 while she was in a coma, and miraculously, after 40 days, she emerged from the coma and had to learn to walk, talk, eat, read, and write all over again. She's alive today. I was with her, in fact, 2 weeks ago in Seattle. She's in her late 20s now, and an amazing testament to overcoming the severities of E. coli, but she still lives with the damage that she suffered. But those were, and I also interviewed the CEO of Jack in the Box and the guy they brought in to run their food safety expert. I tried to get characters from each of the different sides of the story, and the Jack in the Box angle had really never been told. So getting them to cooperate really brought the story to life.
When people see a story like this, they may draw parallels in their mind to the tobacco industry, perhaps, in the way they worked to cover up some of what they were doing, not at first understanding that their product was lethal, and then once they understood it, covering up some of the findings. I'm wondering if you feel like, through telling this story, the food industry and the tobacco industry and some of the other massive consumer issues that we've had over the years, whether or not there are some parallels there to the way these two things have been handled, Jeff.
Well, I think, the food industry in general, you might be able to lump into that category, but Jack in the Box in particular, which my story is about Jack in the Box, I thought one of the things that was so remarkable to me and attractive was the fact that they didn't try to cover up. When the outbreak first broke and it got national headlines, Congress convened hearings right away. Tom Daschle summoned the Jack in the Box president, Bob Nugent, to come out and testify under oath, which he did. And, he got there to testify 2 days after the first child had died in the outbreak. So the country was really focused on this. And he stood up under oath, the CEO of Jack in the Box, and basically said, we didn't know that Washington State had raised the internal cooking temperatures in meat to 155 degrees. So we were cooking at 140, and 140 is not enough to kill E. coli. Hence, we have an outbreak. It turned out later that we discovered that, in fact, Jack in the Box did know that the temperature rules had been changed in Washington, and they weren't following those rules. But it wasn't that they tried to cover it up. I think you had maybe some malfeasance, and I think once they knew that they had really made a huge mistake, I think what was pretty admirable is that they admitted it. And instead of trying to duck and run, they confronted it head on. They accepted responsibility. They compensated all the families, and they didn't go to court and have a long, dragged-out legal fight. They basically, they took full responsibility, ownership of the outbreak, and then they instituted these new food safety protocols that became the industry standard. And that's why I think there's some really inspiring elements to the story. It's something that really every food company should look at as a model.
Now, spin this forward, though. How did food companies then respond over the years? Because obviously the laws did change. The laws still, to Rosa DeLauro's satisfaction and others, have not been changed quite enough, and there's not enough inspection of the food that we eat here in the United States. But as we look at outbreaks that happen later in the 90s, 1996, later 1998, throughout the 2000s, how have corporations dealt with these issues as foodborne illness has been traced to other meat products, but also to vegetables and all sorts of things that we eat?
Yeah, there's a series of things, John, that have been done. I could just tick off 3 or 4 of them that I think most people would be surprised to know are related to the Jack in the Box outbreak. For starters, when you go into a grocery store today, we're all accustomed now to seeing labels on all meat and poultry that tell us, they're warning labels, that tell you to cook to a certain temperature, wash your utensils properly, et cetera, et cetera. That's a direct outgrowth of the Jack in the Box outbreak. Number 2, E. coli was declared an adulterant in every state and by the federal government. Number 3, it's now mandatory for public health officials to report, for medical officials like doctors and hospitals to report to state health departments whenever they have evidence that someone has E. coli, which shows up in a stool culture. Number 4, there was a system of sharing information that, and this is what I think is really important and what Rosa was talking about, is back in 93, state health departments didn't share information. When someone popped up in, say, Minnesota with E. coli, no one else knew about it. Today in America, that's very different. There's a system set up that enables the states and the federal government to interface with each other. It's a network so that when clusters of folks start having a foodborne illness pathogen show up, we know about it. And it enables us to track and isolate more quickly outbreaks. And those are all positive developments that have come out of this. Now, it doesn't change the fact that we have other problems that are, in my mind, huge. She hinted to the fact that, only 1% of our food imported from outside the U.S. is inspected. That's a big problem. Another big problem is that food that's produced inside the U.S., particularly at meat plants, we don't have nearly the amount of inspections going on there that consumers think we have. Probably less than 5% of the meat is actually inspected. I mean, to me, those are risks that we don't need to take. And I think there hasn't been enough emphasis from the Congress on protecting the safety of our food.
But as we hear just recently in Washington, as Republicans have been trying to cut back on the budget of the FDA, what we were talking about earlier, some of them talk about federal regulatory overreach. They essentially feel as though the government shouldn't be getting so much into the business of businesses who are trying to sell us food. I'm wondering, with all that you've written about and looked at, Jeff Benedict, including what you say is a little bit more inspiring tale of how Jack in the Box handled this, do you think that corporate America, the food industry in America, if left to their own devices, will make some of the right choices, will make some changes, and start to inspect things on their own a little bit more carefully if indeed the FDA is weakened and we strip away some of the laws?
This is just one area where I wouldn't leave that to trust. I think if you look at the way industrial or commercial farming is done in the United States today, frankly, I don't even think we should call it farming. But what's done in these huge meatpacking plants or these other huge industrial, food-producing facilities is that it's, to me, you take one visit there and it totally, and I visited some while I was working on this book, it just totally changes your whole outlook on eating and what you want to put on your fork. Look, I just think food is, it's something you put in your body at least 3 times a day or more. And most Americans don't take the time to think seriously about where they're buying and what they're buying. They're buying on cost and taste, and they're buying on the fly. And so if you leave it to the devices of the food industry to just expect or assume they're going to police themselves, I don't think that's a good idea.
But when you say buying on cost or taste, is part of the problem that we buy too much on cost? I know that you are certainly getting into this world of writing about food policy at the same time as many other people, including Michael Pollan, who talks about this stuff. The fact of the matter is that what it costs to eat in America is probably much, much less than it costs to eat other places. The real cost of food, the real cost of producing something locally, producing something safely, is just going to mean a higher price for us all. And I'm wondering if the cost of our everyday meal is part of the issue here.
Well, I agree with you that it's a lot less expensive to eat here than it is in most places in the world. What I was referring to is that most consumers, and 2 years ago I would have put myself in this same group, when we go to the grocery store, most of us buy on two factors. We look at price tags and we look at what tastes best to us. We don't think about other implications. We might spend tons of money on buying the safest car, or fireproofing our house or whatever, but we give short shrift to the nutrition and health of what we eat, many of us. And all I'm saying is that if you buy, for instance, from Michael Pollan's whole thesis, and I agree with it, is that we ought to be focusing a lot more on eating from farmers who grow within 30 miles of our homes. And most of us live in places today where you can do that. Certainly Connecticut's a place where you can do that. And that alone cuts down on an enormous amount of risks to food safety. It doesn't completely isolate the problem and eliminate it. You can get sick eating organic food. It's just the likelihood of that happening is much, much lower. But when you're buying food that's coming from 3,000 to 5,000 miles away or further, first of all, that food is definitely not fresh. It's been treated with some kind of chemical, and you know a lot less about who's handled it and how it was raised and produced. And the simple thing is the risks go up.
We're going to be talking a bit later on in the program about local food and with the Connecticut Department of Agriculture about how local food products are regulated. You can join us at 860-275-7266. A few people want to join the conversation about how safe our food is right now. Do you pay attention to where your food comes from? We'd like to hear from you, 860-275-7266. So what's the cost of all this, Jeff Benedict? At the end of the day, we have thousands of people who are sickened several times a year. As Rosa DeLauro says, some people make the case that people are going to get sick anyway. It's not really a huge amount of our population. What is the overall cost of all these things, both in dollars and in terms of our health, to the safety of our food and the problems with E. coli and other bacteria that you found?
Well, it depends on how you want to measure costs. But basically right now in the United States, there are according to the CDC, there are 48 million illnesses per year from foodborne sickness in the U.S., approximately 125,000 hospitalizations, and roughly 3,000 Americans die annually from foodborne illness. When you start talking about, adding up costs, obviously it's hard to put a price tag on human lives, but there has been an economic study that shows that in the United States alone, foodborne illness costs about $152 billion a year. That sum comes from medical expenses, insurance costs, and lost wages. It's a staggering number. And, so I just think that, I'll tell you, John, if you want to personalize it, I will point the finger at myself and say that I was one of those people who was pretty careless about what I ate as long as it tasted good. And working on this book changed me dramatically. I mean, we now, and not everybody can do this, but we went through the effort in our family to plant not just a garden, but we grow an awful lot of what we eat now, and we grow it organically on our property. And what we can't grow, we buy. I would say 90% of what we don't grow, we buy from local farms. They're not all organic farms, but they're all local farms, and they're practicing, high standards. And it's not only made us feel better, from a health standpoint, but I like the fact, and it's not that we're not spending a lot more money than we used to when we went to the grocery store and bought food that was a lot less healthy. So I think there's somewhat of a myth to the notion that, well, if you try to buy organic food or locally grown food, that it's going to cost you a lot more. It's not costing us a lot more, and it's a lot healthier.
I want to go to the phones here. Joe's in Norwich. Hi, Joe. You're on Where We Live.
Hi. I had a question about the comment that we should be eating within 30 miles of our home, which I think is a great idea. But what are we supposed to do in the winter? When can I only have salads between June and August when that 30-mile-an-hour radius is able to produce that kind of food?
Great question, and I deal with that because I'm a guy. I'm just a sucker for strawberries and blueberries, and obviously they don't grow in season in December. But I think the reality of it is there's a lot of wisdom in trying to eat what's in season. And if you want strawberries in December, like me, then you're going to get them from South America. And they're going to be injected with some kind of gas to ripen them and make them look beautifully red when they come. They will not be fresh because they've traveled on a boat for 5,000 miles. And those are so you may buy that at the grocery store and say, hey, great, I'm getting my strawberries in December like I want. But you've got to know that the reality is that's not really what you want. What you want is what you're getting right now in the U.S., which is fresh strawberries, because this is strawberry season. And it's not like in December you can't get excellent products. It just may not be what you get in the summer. And so it's a trade-off. You've got to decide whether you want to eat what's in season, then you eat certain things in the winter and certain things in the fall. And, that's the way it used to be, and nobody really complained. It's really been in the last 20 years or 30 years that we've gotten really accustomed to eating anything we want any time of the year.
I want to go to Joanne in Willimantic. Hi, Joanne. You're on Where We Live.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Yeah.
Your caller had mentioned that someone had done testing for different strains of E. coli in industrial meatpacking plants and found that they could do this and found some different strains than what was being tested for by the government. And I belong to a community-supported agriculture. I buy my meat from one. And has anyone actually tested a variety of local meat sources to see whether or not they're safer, they're cleaner? I mean, I have the impression that they are. I know the farmer. I know what he does. Know where the meat is packaged. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, you know what, and Jeff Benedict, I'm going to ask you to hold for just one second because I want to bring into the conversation our next guest who might be able to do a good job of answering that. Wayne Kosacek is with the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. He's Assistant Director for the Bureau of Regulation and Inspection there. Wayne, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
And I'm not sure if you just heard Joanne's question about that, but she's wondering about some of the locally produced meats and how they're tested and how she knows that they're safe. It's good to eat local, but how do we know that they're safe?
Well, as far as red meats are concerned, those meats are typically processed at a USDA facility under the same inspection program that the United States Department of Agriculture has for all meats. If she's purchasing meats directly from a farmer, I suspect those meats have a USDA stamp on them.
And so the standards for locally produced meat, something at a local farm, no different than what you'd get in the supermarket or anyplace else.
Well, if there is such a thing as custom, where we do have several facilities throughout the state that do custom meats that are not necessarily under USDA inspection, but those are processing animals that people have raised themselves. So meat that is for sale, meat that is sold, is meat that has come under USDA inspection.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue with Wayne Kosacek from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture and talk a bit about what we know about the safety of Connecticut food, how we test for food that's grown right here on our farm, some new laws about poultry production in the state. We're also joined by Jeff Benedict. He's got a new book called Poisoned, the true story of the deadly E. coli outbreak that changed the way Americans eat. Jeff Benedict, of course, best-selling author of the book Little Pink House. He's been on the program before. We'd like to hear from you. How do you determine how safe your food is? Do you think about the food that you put on your table? 860-275-7266 or email wherewelive@WNPR.org. This is Where We Live. I'm John Dankosky. Coming up on tomorrow's show, so Connecticut has tackled its enormous budget deficit through new taxes and happier revenue projections and a tentative deal on massive union concessions. So what's next? Well, now we might be up against the spending cap. How did that happen? We'll find out what is going on at the Capitol, and we'll check in with Missouri native Susan Campbell, who's just back from Joplin, Missouri. You can join the conversation where we live, on air and online at WNPR.org, keyword where. Today we're talking about food safety. It's a major outbreak of foodborne illness in Europe. It's coming at the same time as lawmakers in Washington are cutting back on the FDA's authority to regulate food. How do you make decisions about what to put on your plate? How much do you think about the safety of your food every day? You can call us at 860-275-7266. We're joined today by Jeff Benedict. He's the author of the new book called Poisoned, the True Story of the Deadly E. coli Outbreak that Changed the Way Americans Eat. Wayne Kosachik also joins us for a few minutes here. He's from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. There's new state poultry inspection programs that have been put in place, Wayne, something that I know farmers and others have been looking for. What exactly does this mean for consumers in the state?
Well, last year, Public Act 10103 was passed and gave our department the authority to inspect small poultry processors. These are processors that would be exempt from USDA inspection, and it allows them to market their poultry to food service establishments like restaurants.
And so that essentially means that we're able to get more locally produced poultry in the state, right? That
is the goal of the legislation, and the goal of the department is to increase locally produced foods in restaurants and farmers markets and places like that.
Now we've seen just recently an article in the New York Times talking about some of the confusing regulations that farmers and others run up against. People who have supermarkets that buy from local farms, and some of the products are okay to be grown and handled locally. Other products are not. It all seems very confusing. Maybe very quickly, Wayne, you can take us through exactly who's in charge of regulating whether or not it's produce or poultry or meat, because I think a lot of people would like to grow and also buy locally, but there are some confusing regulations in the books for many.
Well, maybe I'll take a crack at it. They're confusing for us too.
Yeah.
At the federal level, essentially, the federal government regulates the interstate movement of all products, and food is certainly one of them. USDA inspects red meats, slaughter facilities, places like that, poultry processing facilities. As far as poultry is concerned, there are certain exemptions in the Poultry Product Inspection Act that facilities processing under a certain number of birds are not required to be, quote, inspected by USDA. And that's where this legislation stepped in, and in Connecticut, we don't have large poultry processors, and they needed an inspection process to comply with the public health code that regulates where restaurants purchase their foods from. So the department is now charged with providing poultry inspection for these smaller processors. In Connecticut, regulation of food safety is divided among three agencies. The Department of Agriculture, we're primarily involved with milk safety, milk and milk products, cheese, some shell egg inspections, again, smaller producers that do not receive USDA inspection.
Well, and then you say, and then other agencies also have some of this, because we're running low on time. I guess what I wonder quickly, Wayne, is should this be more streamlined? Should we be having this split between three different agencies with ag handling some, other departments handling other things?
Well, the three agencies, we do work together. We have our sandboxes that we play in that are established by the legislature. So that's a policy decision that's above my pay grade, and we, in a perfect world, maybe.
Well, I have one more quick question for you. We got a tweet from Joe who says, "I hope you talk about the pickle bill passed by the Connecticut General Assembly in 2010." He says it's an insidious attack on food safety in Connecticut. What's the pickle bill?
Well, as part of the Farm Foods and Jobs bill, the exemption for farm kitchens was expanded to include acidified foods, which pickles are one of them, salsas are another, and it allows farmers to manufacture pickles and salsa and foods like that in their home kitchens, provided they meet certain requirements, the pH and source of the foods and stuff like that. And they can market these products directly to consumers through farmers markets or through their farm stands.
Well, and this is interesting. Jeff Benedict, just to get back to some of what we were talking about, so here's an interesting balance. Okay, so Connecticut is allowing more different types of producers to produce food in small quantities, maybe even in their kitchens. Somebody who tweets us says, this is an insidious attack on food safety, but it's also helping people buy and produce food locally. It seems as though these two things we're talking about, Jeff, are kind of at odds in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they don't have to be, though. I mean, and part of the benefit of, I'm a big supporter of allowing local farmers and small farmers to produce and not be saddled with so many regulations that they can't be effective and they can't make a living. And that's why I don't think it's that difficult, though, to strike the proper balance. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think you want to have local small farmers who are producing enough food to sell it, and make a living off it without any inspections, so that you don't know anything about, how this food is being raised and handled. But on the other hand, I don't think that those small farms need to be regulated to the degree that, say, ConAgra's facilities are, where they're dealing with hundreds of thousands of heads of cattle or pigs or whatever. And I think that that's the difference, is that there's not like one approach that works for these huge industrial complexes and another one that works for Farmer Joe around the corner who may have 2 cows on his farm. And that's the difference. But the other thing, John, to keep in mind is the benefit of these local farms and these farmers markets is that, and why I'm a big proponent of them. In our case, we've actually visited virtually every farm that we buy products from at the farmers market. Most of these farmers are eager to have you come and look at their facilities. They want you to see how they raise their animals and their produce and how they're butchered and how they're packaged. It's something they're not only proud of, but I think it's a big selling point. You try to go visit a big meat packing plant, you can't get in.
Well, yeah, and you probably don't want to go anyway. If you could, Marlo is on a cell phone. Quickly, Marlo, you're on Where We Live.
Hi, 3 points. I'm up in Goshen, and to respond to the cry for fruit in winter, I have a small patch of raspberries, 10 by 15 feet, and I've been having fruit along with my partner for the whole year, a couple of times a week. 2, the importance of gardens and local. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can. Keep going. You're running out of time.
I was at an ice cream stand over in Oxford a few years ago, and the dairy is right there, and ice cream stands right next door to the barn. And there were children who had no idea the milk came from the cows. So I think there's a really important connection to be made at our local farmers markets that is so important, especially in an age where we have, to quote one author who came out with a book in, 2006? Nature deficit disorder. We need to get more connected. So,
well, and Marlo, thank you very much for the phone call, because I think it leaves us in a good place after all this. Certainly, I think we want to get out to the farm and see where our food is coming from. Jeff Benedict would certainly suggest that. He's the author of Poison, the true story of the deadly E. coli outbreak that changed the way Americans eat. Another interesting book, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
I also want to thank Wayne Kosacek. He's Assistant Director for the Bureau of Regulation and Inspection at the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. There's a lot more conversation that people want to have, so you can join us at WNPR.org, keyword where, and keep the conversation going there. Our program is produced by Josie Holtzman. The senior producer is Katie Tolarski. Thanks to Tucker Ives today. Coming up tomorrow, our regional reporter roundtable will find out what's happening at the Capitol. We'll also check in with our friend Susan Campbell. She's a Missouri native who just returned from Joplin, Missouri, the site of those tornadoes. You can join us again tomorrow here on Where We Live. I'm John Dankowski. Thanks for joining us.